We're a nonprofit organization dedicated to eradicating human slavery, human trafficking, child exploitation, and child sexual abuse material through disrupting networks and applying data, technology, and advanced analytics and intelligence.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today at the Anti-Human Trafficking Intelligence Initiative Second Annual Virtual Summit. This panel is going to discuss AML leadership's take on the regulatory view of human trafficking and CSAM. And as you'll see when I give us brief introductions, no offense to the age of any of us, but when I say leadership, we've all been around dealing with these issues for quite a long time. So hopefully this sort of macro view will be useful to you. I'm Alma Angadi. I'm a partner in Guidehouse Financial Services. For the last 10 years, I've been a consultant, but before that, I have 25 years of senior enforcement position at the SEC, FinCEN, and FINRA. And with me today for this is my favorite panel. We could talk all day on this. Carol Bamier is a senior managing director in Protivity's risk and compliance practice and leads Protivity's APAC financial services practice. She's a former regulator with 35 years of experience, and she works with domestic and foreign financial institutions on a wide range of regulatory matters, including financial crimes compliance. Carol's also written extensively and is you know, if you've joined us before, she's a frequent speaker on regulatory issues in the US and internationally. Jim Richards brings 30 plus years of experience in financial crime risk management as a special constable with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, a prosecutor in Massachusetts, and for 15 years as the BSA officer and global head of financial crime risk management at one of the largest banks in the United States. Since 2018, he's had his own consulting firm and is an advisor to a number of fintech companies. Ren York is a compliance and risk management financial services professional with nearly 25 years of we have centuries of experience here, guys. Proven experience within a variety of financial institutions, including commercial, community, investment, and private banking, as well as with a U.S. government corporation operating as an independent agency created by the Banking Act of 1933. He maintains a special focus on safety and soundness, consumer protection, and technical business analysis. He's a certified anti-money laundering specialist, a certified risk and compliance management professional, holds a certificate in enterprise risk management frameworks from the American Bankers Association, and is a member of the Institute of Internal Auditors. And last but certainly not least, Karim Washwani has over 40 years of risk and compliance experience, including over 20 years in AML. He's held a number of financial crime related senior positions at large financial institutions, including global head of financial crime. Karim also serves on a number of advisory boards focused on human trafficking and ACAMs. He also serves on the Canadian Prime Minister National Security Advisory Committee. So as you can see, this panel, we have seen these issues evolve over a very long time, which leads us to what we're going to talk about first. As we were discussing this, we were happy to see some additional regulatory focus on human trafficking issues. But Jim, why don't you kick us off to discuss some of the recent developments at FinCEN, not as much focus as we'd like, but yet something.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Alma. Thanks for having me. So in the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2000, which was passed on January 1st of 2020, it was passed on January 1st of 2021. It included 8 new national priorities that came out. And one of the 8 was human trafficking and human smuggling. Now, I think we're going to talk a little bit about some of the differences between the two, and smooching them together like that might not have been the best thing. But it was a great development to have those national priorities in human trafficking as one of the national priorities. Because the important thing about that section is it compels financial institutions to include those priorities in their programs and for the regulatory agencies to examine them on how they have implemented those priorities in their programs. So I think that focus, Alma, on human trafficking in financial institutions programs is a great development.
So Ren, you were going to talk a little bit about some of the statistics we've seen.
Yeah, and I totally agree with Jim. By the way, thank you for the invite. It's a pleasure to work with each of you, and I will always accept the invite to work with this panel. I agree with Jim entirely, and it's kind of perplexing because when I hear conversations along, well, this is kind of new. No, it's not. You could date back and point to various materials, including FinCEN's 2014 advisory, and then it was supplemented in 2020. They've been very clear about definitions, explanations, resources, and even how to put the reporting of human trafficking into both the narrative and into the SARS to FinCEN. So this is not new, and I agree with Jim that it's very important that it's a priority, and it does make it convoluted. I agree with Jim on that, because if you look at the FinCEN SAR report that came out earlier this year, where they were reflecting information for all the SARs filed from 2014 to 2021. Unfortunately, when you group human trafficking with smuggling, it kind of makes it difficult to understand, well, how much of that was human trafficking versus smuggling. And then also when on the trafficking side, it's not just one size or one issue. It's labor, it's sex trafficking, and something that we're not talking about today, but could be incorporated, is both organ trafficking and embryo trafficking. So there's a lot to unwind and peel back on that. But as far as FinCEN capturing information from financial institutions about the appearance of human trafficking, is again, that's the burden, that's the regulatory burden for financial institutions. Do you see this? If you see something, say something. In order to understand what you see, there's all these resources, including red flags, so that helps to facilitate that. The information a financial institution may see could get to FinCEN, and FinCEN law enforcement could work with that. The problem with the report that came out for 2014 to 2021 shows exclusively, among other things, that the reporting for human trafficking dipped down from 2020. So if you compare 2021 to 2020 numbers, it dipped down almost 4%, which is really absurd when you think about it, because we know that human trafficking is on the rise. It's being reflected in the DOJ programs, including by way of funding to the Office of Victims of Crimes, the OVC. Their funding, if you look into their program over the years, I think their initial budget was 10 million or a little bit more than that back in 2010-ish, 2011, and then it shot all the way up to 88 million, which is well over 750%. So, you start trying to connect these dots, and you can see that, okay, one of these things doesn't go with the others, right? And it's not making sense that financial institutions aren't reporting more appearance of human trafficking, whether it's qualifying in the sex trafficking focus or in the labor trafficking focus.
So Karim, one of the issues when the regulators expect you to report something is you have to actively look for it. You can't just report it if you happen to notice. Now that's particularly difficult with human trafficking, and you might want to share with the group, the audience, why that is, and how banks are using technology to help with that problem to identify and recognize some of these typologies.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, as mentioned, this is a massive problem, right? And if we look at the reports, $150 billion industry, which, according to these reports, is the third, fourth, fifth largest financial crime activity. If you compare the number of SARS institutions filed, it does not reflect the magnitude of the crime. And every report says it's going up. And human trafficking is a pretty broad label, right? There's so much within that which we may not get time to dive into. But also child sexual exploitation, post-COVID, it's gone through the roof, right? Just last week, Stats Canada published another report, same message. I think what's happened is there's been a lot of initiatives, but there have been projects. The US Bankers Alliance, the European Bankers Alliance, Project Shadow, Project Protect. These have all been projects and have been very successful projects, but somehow we've not operationalized this. Some of the challenges, I think, with human trafficking in particular, I mean, transaction monitoring is difficult at best. You know, we invest tens of millions, hundreds of millions for a return, you know, which is fairly low. I mean, normally no institution would invest that kind of money for such low returns on investment. With crimes like human trafficking, what you're really talking about is low value per transaction and, relatively speaking, low frequency, right? You put that into sort of an institution, 40, 50, 100 million customers, billions of dollars a day, and it's not even a needle in a haystack type problem, right? It's a needle in needle type of a problem. And this is where I think institutions have historically struggled to say, how do we actually operationalize this without creating such a burden on ourselves, a regulatory burden around building these rules, making sure they comply with the regulatory requirements, model validation, and most importantly, you know, the operational impact and the resources then needed. And we know 90+% are going to be false positives. How do you solve for that? And I can share my thoughts on sort of what's worked for me later on.
So Carol, we've been talking a lot about what's happening in the US and Canada, but like much crime, it is global. And yet we have local jurisdiction, which can make it much more difficult for law enforcement. But what are some of the issues outside of the US and Canada and North America that you're seeing some of your clients grappling with?
I've actually been thinking about this a lot in the context of the Ukrainian refugee crisis, which I think is obviously a very stark reminder of how quickly a humanitarian crisis can become a trafficking crisis. And as with most humanitarian crises, whether they're man-made or Mother Nature made, there's not very much time to react and prepare. And traffickers know this and they take advantage of it. And as the media and a lot of the aid organizations started talking more and more about the trafficking risks stemming from the Ukrainian refugee crisis, I started thinking about the global regulatory reaction. And I checked out a couple of the websites of the global regulators whose sites I often go to when I'm trying to get a feel for what the global reaction is. I talked with some of my Protiviti colleagues in other countries, and I really kind of came away with the view that the regulatory reaction to trafficking is somewhat muted. And I don't mean to suggest that they don't care, but in a lot of countries, the main focus really seemed to come more from supply chain, from other governmental bodies, where the focus really seemed to be more on child labor or unfair labor practices in the supply chain, and far less from actions that the regulators themselves were taking or efforts that the regulators were undertaking. I think, you know, similar to the comment Jim made, I feel in the US, the fact that trafficking is now a national priority is a reason for optimism. I think potentially a global reason for optimism might be the great emphasis we're seeing across the globe now on ESG. And I'm hopeful that as companies incorporate ESG, and the regulators in many jurisdictions seem very much on board with ESG efforts, that this will be another way to shine some light on trafficking and you know, improve the regulatory focus that we're seeing in some areas across the globe.
Hey, Alma, if I can just sort of try to tie in, if I can tie in what Alma and Karim have just said. So Carol, Carol was talking about the international side of it, which is critical. Karim was talking about the monitoring and surveillance side of it. I think what a lot of people tend to forget a little bit is that it is a domestic issue. Young American girls are being trafficked.
Sure.
Yeah. Right. So that's, I think, an important aspect of this. It's not all international. And then I think it's also behavioral. And FinCEN had that in its advisory. It had financial indicators and behavioral indicators. And when I was in my previous role, we spent a lot of time training our tellers and trusting our tellers, because a lot of the human trafficking manifested itself in the branches.
Yeah, I'd like to
Because
jump
you were dealing with a lot of cash, right? That's exactly right. And that makes it a little more difficult now in this digital environment to see those behaviors. Ren, please, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I'm not begging your pardon. I didn't mean to interrupt. I was thinking about what Jim just said and what Carol and Karim said previously. So agree with Karim that, you know, the monetary side and the needle in the haystack, that can be, when you're looking, no offense, that's kind of looking through the lens of in-house information, right? So financial institutions can go outside their houses and get a lot more information to help increase their percentages, numbers, so on and so forth. With Carol, it's interesting because in listening to Carol, I remember seeing a report earlier that came out of the UK where there were questions around, and I'm paraphrasing, but like, who's responsible for combating human trafficking? And the number one response by almost 70% of the participants was the government. You know, at the very end of all the options were financial institutions. But then that kind of makes sense, because the government isn't saying, hey, financial institutions, you're responsible for identifying this, and you're responsible for managing it, and you're responsible for preventing it. That's not what they're saying. They're saying, if you see something, say something. And so now we've got back to what Carol was saying, you know, an awareness issue, and what Jim was also referring to. And that's the call here for financial institutions is, how can you have a program that, based on your institution's size, complexities, resources, demographics, everything, suits where you're helping to combat human trafficking? What are you doing, given the technology, the actors, the resources, the training that's available, the red flags, the topology, and most especially the technology?
So that's a really good lead in, Karim, to get back to you to talk about, look, there, like you said, Ren, they're going to be, depending on the institutions, lots of approaches. So I want to talk about what institutions who don't have access to the technology that Karim has developed, what they can do. But first, Karim, how have you seen successful use of technologies to find that needle in a stack of needles?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, you've got to understand the problem you're tackling with human trafficking. You know, it is a domestic problem, as Jim said. It's important to understand that. So one of the exercises, projects we did, which is now operationalized, is looking at massage parlors and how massage parlors are used to traffic. And the techniques used there were around entity resolution and graphing, right? Is understanding who are these massage parlors, how are they connected, connecting email addresses and phone numbers from external websites, right? And I totally agree with leveraging external data, ingesting that data and saying, well, you've got all these women tied to this massage parlor. You don't see payroll. So I think traditional rules-based techniques, in my opinion, do not work. Or for the 1%, you can't afford for them to work. So you've got to use different, I'd call them advanced analytic techniques. And more, I think in the past 5-7 years, regulators are open to fintech and new ideas, right? So one was on massage parlors. Another one was on domestic human trafficking, right? We used over 60 data points, right? A traditional rules-based system, value, volume, frequency, country, 5-6 levers, you don't stick a chance of doing that. We used over 60 data points. A Visa transaction, hotel booked on a Visa transaction. Okay, that's on its own, but not paid for by Visa, right? P2P payments, email money transfers. Visa's being used in multiple cities, for example. So what we did was, one, use traditional human trafficking topologies and built a model around that. Secondly, looking at flow-through patterns with low-value payment channels, right? Whether that be cash, ATMs, P2P payments, using natural language processing to look at suspicious emails, matching email addresses, looking for keywords. Often in the P2P payment, the password or the comments field will often say what's it's for. As stupid as that sounds, right? So the data is there. Leveraging, vendor information, they scrape these ad sites, leveraging all of that. And then, as I mentioned, using network analysis, entity resolution, and graphing to take these 6 techniques, combine them into one. And we've seen success rates of 50% plus. And in some cases, 90% plus, depending on sort of the trafficking type model. Now, this is not something that runs daily. This has to run monthly, quarterly, with 60 to 600 data points. And in one case, model validation, regulatory approval becomes a major challenge because you're using pretty advanced techniques, pretty advanced AI-based techniques. And I know that word is overused. So it really becomes a challenge. Typically what I've said is, look, guys, this is in a project pilot mode. It's going to run every 90 days for the next 2 years until we begin to understand how to sort of document this. At the end of the day, this is about saving lives, not passing an audit exam.
That's a very, when I was a regulator, and sometimes the institutions, not in human trafficking, they would say, what do you want me to do? What would make you happy? And I would say, you're not making me happy. You're managing your risk. And if you manage your risk, I will be happy. I promise you. Right.
Exactly.
And so it's really important to keep your eye on the ball. So to the other folks on the panel, I think it's fascinating what Karim and some of his institutions have managed to do with technology. But even if you plan to be able to implement a system like that, what can you do in the meantime to better identify this? Because I'm sure a lot of it is identified just as general suspicious activity, high cash transactions or something like that. But that's not going to get the attention of the right people, or as Karim said, save someone. So how can other community banks, smaller banks, other kinds of financial institutions, what can they do in the meantime until some of this sophisticated AI becomes more accessible?
Yeah, one of the things, Alma, and I agree, this is sort of, does take investment resources, right? Project Shadow in Canada focused on child sexual exploitation. With the Noble, we are working on Project Umbra, right? Is to say, hey, actually just look at adverse media. That adverse media is available, whether you do a open internet research, whether you use a vendor, it really doesn't matter. Every day, just do that. Look at who's been charged, convicted, right, alleged. Look at the financial patterns. And Project Shadow was based on that, was based on no analytics at all,
Wow.
No monitoring. It was based on, let's look at adverse media. Well, why would you want to do that if the person's been charged? Well, you're improving awareness in your organization. This is real, it's happening, and we're contributing if we don't deal with it. You are providing intelligence to law enforcement agencies, which they never had. You're providing other connected parties. So there's real value in low-hanging fruits.
That's great. I think people don't realize that sometimes. Anyone else have, that's a fabulous suggestion. Any other thoughts from the clients you've worked with in helping them focus on this, maybe in a lower tech way? Ren?
Pardon me. It would be beneficial if there was some sort of handbook on how to start. Where do you start, right? So let's just run with the premise of 0. it probably would make sense for the institution to do an analysis of what is human trafficking and what's going on and what are the resources, and have a matrix of that information. And then bounce that off of the bank and its objectives and its products and services and clients and footprint, and get an assessment of, well, what's our risk in these areas? Some banks are going to be at more risk than others with sex trafficking versus labor trafficking. And as you start this in-flight analysis, you'll also get exposed to various programs, whether they're potential partnerships outside the bank that are for-profit entities or non-profit entities. So now you've got a lot of potential external partners to work with. Some are free, some are not. And there are other avenues for building a program that suits your shop, so that at the end of the journey, not the end of the journey, because this is ongoing, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. At some point during the assessment by the auditors and examiners, they could say with confidence that you've got an adequate program. And we both know adequate, it is a beautiful world in the regulatory dictionary. It means it's just what it should be. So, but then there are other ways, you know, there are other pillars, if you will, to a successful program. And one is that you've got a training program. You've ingested all the red flags, and you've got a training program to help your staff understand, especially the customer-facing ones, that when you see something, this is what you do. So when you see this, the next step is you're going to fill out some sort of observation that goes from the first line of defense to the second line of defense, so they could do further due diligence. There are ways of also making impact on your local community, and it could be a double win, because you could, earlier we were talking about ESG and CSR, corporate social responsibility, and I don't know of what bigger connection you can make with CSR than combating human trafficking, but tie that into Community Reinvestment Act. You know, there's opportunities for banks to do a 2-for-1 where they're doing an outreach. Jim had mentioned that, you know, children are brought into this. And so why not start making an effort to work with junior high or middle school, whatever the naming convention, in high school. A lot of universities are already doing anti-human trafficking program to one extent or another, and they're actually getting rated on their program. So let's spread the education around, and financial institutions can help, and they can get CRA credit in the process. So there's so much out there you can do and get started and technically be in flight, and then build your program as you go based on your risk assessment and your resources and the returns you're getting in terms of, it'd be wonderful for FinCEN to give a little bit more clarity on, hey, this is how you should report labor trafficking compared to sex trafficking, but also feedback on those SARs with useful information. They've gotten better about recognizing certain institutions for their SARs that they file in the outcomes, but they probably should do something a little bit more public, which could be a little tricky, right? Because then the perps get that information. But to the extent that there's an incentive to entice banks, that when you see something, say something, because that's the regulatory burden.
And actually, FinCEN is tasked in the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020 with coming up with a better feedback loop. Now, talking about feedback, Jim, you have some really interesting thoughts about how the government should go about a program quality assessment for identifying human trafficking, and with a Community Reinvestment Act like lens.
Yeah.
Do you want to go into
Sure. And before I jump into that, what Karim said, this was so important. They've developed this very sophisticated model, but they couldn't get it past their model governance, you know, sort of minions or whatever they are. And so he said, oh, it's not a model, it's a pilot. And so the fact that you have to do a head fake end run around your model risk management people speaks volumes, particularly in what we are now calling a risk-based approach to AML CFT. Well, what's a bigger risk than human trafficking? You know, about 7 or 8 years ago, I was involved in setting up this, and I'm not allowed to talk about it too much, but this association of financial institutions to get together as a 314B association. The first case we selected was human trafficking, because we all said to ourselves, who can complain about a group of banks getting together to fight human trafficking? and it was wildly successful. But I think, Ren, you might have said something about, you can kind of be okay. The regulators will say you're okay, and that's the best you can do, right? So under the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act, the regulators do evaluations of those programs, and they issue public ratings. Outstanding, satisfactory, needs to improve, or substantial non-compliance, I think is the fourth one. But in BSA AML, you only hear when a bank gets in trouble. Wouldn't it be, and I've written an article on this, it was published back in January of 2019. I said they should take, for BSA, they should take a CRA-like approach. The regulators can examine 15 or 20 larger banks every year and issue a public report. Karim's bank is outstanding for its work around BSA AML, and I would focus on the real risks, and one of them, it's not a bigger one, frankly, is human trafficking. And reward banks for having an outstanding program.
And look, especially a lot of the younger customers of financial institutions, that's why ESG went forward without the government, because people care, and they care about human trafficking, and they care about social justice, and they care about all of these things that that would be, so the banks would benefit from people knowing the resources and the effort they're putting into some of this.
And there is a push, in the absence of the government stepping in, there is a push from private NGO type organizations to actually provide a ESG score. I mean, we know of the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, but specifically around human crime, a number of organizations are saying, well, I think I forget the name of the European organization, to specifically assess and rate ESG. And I think that's well overdue.
Well, to Jim's point on CRA being public, that's another aspect that could be blown up a little bit louder, if you will. Every branch is obligated to share their Community Reinvestment Act performance evaluation with customers who ask for it. And for those customers where this is an important issue, go to your bank and say, I want to see your CRA PE. And if you don't see anything in there about their efforts, with combating human trafficking, ask them, maybe that's going to help them to rethink that, our customers are asking about this, maybe we should think about this.
So Carol, what can governments do to help the banks do what, and other financial institutions do what they need to do?
So I think there are a number of things. When I look at kind of a good framework for dealing with human trafficking or addressing a human trafficking, I default, not original thinking here, to the 4P paradigm that the State Department uses, which is leveraged on the UN protocols. So looking at prevention, which is all about what we've been talking about already, the awareness and the education around trafficking. Protection, which is making sure that survivors have the resources and help they need. And in that context, I was thrilled last month to see the U.S. Consumer Federal Protection Bureau come out with a proposal that would prohibit credit reporting agencies from using adverse information that was developed during the period in which someone was trafficked from affecting their credit standing going forward. So right there, and certainly something that anxiously will watch the developments. Next P is prosecution from a government standpoint. And I think if you look at the stats globally, the prosecution of traffickers is still pretty low. So there's certainly an effort to raise prosecution as a greater deterrent. And the last P is partnership. And this is the broadest possible partnership that I can think of, because it's not just government and businesses, it's a lot of the aid agencies, it's the media, it's law enforcement, and I think it's all of us. And if I kind of take those 4 Ps and look at them from a government perspective, particularly a regulatory perspective, I think I would focus on the prevention. So we've already talked a lot about how there is such an opportunity for the regulators to help in the education side of this. And I guess I'd add a fifth P, and maybe that is priority. And that goes back to Jim's initial comments around the national priorities. And we have this opportunity now, at least in the US, and I think it exists in other jurisdictions as well, to have a greater emphasis on trafficking in the examination process. Within the context of everything Karim said, though, about not making this a punitive exercise that you didn't do something or you can't fit it into your traditional model. It really needs to be an outcomes-based exercise.
Yeah, and I'd throw in there, Alma, that, we've talked about FinCEN and its guidance, and the AML Act was entirely a Title 31 Act. They didn't touch Title 12, which was the banking regulations, right? Or laws and regulations. So I would be a little aggressive here and say the OCC, FDIC, NCUA, and Federal Reserve have to step up. And they have to issue, if not regulations, certainly guidance that says when it comes to human trafficking, there's no model risk management here, guys. Just go for it. Be aggressive. And we're not going to ding you if you miss some stuff. So we got to solve this problem, I think. And I would really lean on the prudential regulators. That's just me, though. So anyway.
That's their job, Jim. It's their job.
Yeah, 100% agree.
And
then training, I think, is not a P, it's a T. But I think, again, the regulators could come up with, here's how you train your frontline people. Because I know from my experience that tellers, they were really good at spotting this stuff, but they were nervous about doing it. They didn't, want to upset their branch manager, et cetera, et cetera. But I think if you could really get some solid training for tellers, you could make a big difference locally.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, suspicious activity reporting, and you look at the conversion rates from transaction monitoring, anywhere from 1% to at best 25%, right? With an enormous amount of investment in technology and rules and all the other stuff that needs to be done. The conversion rates from branch referrals is upwards of 40%. Yeah. So they really do know what they're looking at.
Yeah,
they
know their customers, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's where the training, to Jim's point, that's where the training really does come in. Right?
Yeah, how to spot that person, things like somebody who's always with someone else, who appears nervous about it, who appears to be controlled. There's a lot of things that you can notice as a teller or frontline associate at a money transmitter or something like that, that could really be helpful to helping somebody. And Jim, you had an idea about identifying high-intensity human trafficking geographies, or that FinCEN could help folks understand that maybe in some parts of the country it's going to be human smuggling and forced labor more than sex trafficking, but in other parts of the country or other times of year, it might be child exploitation. So you want to talk about that a little bit? Because I thought that was also a fascinating concept.
Is that Carol or me?
Maybe it was Carol.
Carol?
I actually think it was Ren's initial idea.
Oh, Ren, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I think as we've discussed it before.
We just talked.
As we discussed it. Yeah, I think the concept is very similar, right? And I think that we can debate both sides of this. I mean, I think living in a major metropolitan area like New York, it's kind of telling the financial institutions the obvious, right? But to the extent that it increases awareness and increases sensitivity and causes institutions to just think again about their risk in their local marketplace, I can see this as something that could be additive.
And it also
I think-
reinforces that the regulators are going to be looking for you to pay attention.
Mhm.
Like you said, Jim, you don't necessarily want, micromanagement, but they're going to want to see you're paying attention. And then that's a way for you to tell your business management, if you're an institution, look, this is people don't want to believe bad things are happening in their communities. And this can be a very invisible crime. And so the more information you can get to the decision makers, as you say, the more successful the compliance team's likely to be in getting some resources or focus.
And I don't know where the Super Bowl is next year, but I think if not actually, at least anecdotally, we know that there's a lot of sex trafficking around the Super Bowl. So what I would do if I was running FinCEN, I would roll out a GTO this October. So we have the GTO running in, let's say it's Miami, if that's where the Super Bowl is going to be. It's running in October for the hotels and call it massage parlors, whatever we want to target. In October, November, December, January, Super Bowl hits in February. So now we've got 4 months of pre-Super Bowl activity, and then it's going to run for a month after the Super Bowl. And let's take a look at what happens. What was the activity? What did we see? I think we'd see something really interesting.
Yeah, to Jim's point, to put in a plug for the Noble, which is an NGO focused on human crime. One of the projects they've been running over the past year or so is exactly the Super Bowl project, they're calling it. And it's primarily focused on financial institutions to say, hey, we know this is happening. Let's collectively work on this. There's no information sharing, so we don't go down that rabbit hole. And in fact, I think the Noble just recently put out another request to say, hey, those guys want to join the Super Bowl project, please, complete this. So, if you want to make a difference, go to the Noble, join the project. You can actually make a difference, and you'll educate yourself at a minimum. All right, so I would totally support that. On the high intensity human trafficking areas, I support that, but I think we've got to be careful. One, there's an enormous amount of information already on this. Polaris and others have published. So leverage that. Also, everything becomes high risk. It's like high risk industries. Everything is high risk. Well, nothing is high risk. If everything is high risk, nothing is high risk. And then, you go down sort of the other rabbit hole. Well, you've got to actually, now that it's a high intensity, demonstrate to me your rules reflect that. Where it's a really, really important data point if provided properly. Hey, guys, your problem is 60%, sex trafficking, of which it's women, it's domestic, New York area, that's your priority, right? That can be useful information as opposed to saying New York is, high risk for human trafficking. I really don't even know what to do with that, really.
Right. That's a good point, Karim. If it can be more specific as to what are the typologies that are common in your area. I mean, that's what GTOs are partly for the government to collect information and also to disrupt typologies like they did with the GTO for cash reporting in the fashion district in LA. That was merely disruptive. So those are both good goals, whereas the real estate GTOs seem to be more information collecting. Geographic targeting orders are orders that FinCEN can issue that require special record keeping and reporting in a very narrow either geography or business, something like that, so they don't have to roll out a rule for the entire country if they think a problem is very specific. So it's actually quite an interesting tool that they've used periodically. Well, I think we're almost to the end of our time, although as we all know, guys, we can talk about this all day and have on occasion. But as usual, this is my favorite panel of the year. anyone have any parting words? And I feel like we were practical. We gave people some practical tips, practical information. Anything I've forgotten to ask or that we think we need to get across?
I would say to institutions, even non-financial, is take a step, reach out, reach out to us. There's a massive community out there, who are willing to help. Then there's an enormous amount of information on this, not enormous. So, if you say, I don't know about it, and no, there's so much information out there. It's difficult to digest all of it. Digest and take that simple step, whatever that simple step is, whether it's training your frontline staff, whether it's doing an adverse media screening, whether it's contributing to an NGO, that's fine, but at least take a step. Don't sit on the fence.
You could save someone's life.
Yeah.
I would say two things. One is for those who aren't sure about the connection or association with combating human trafficking and corporate social responsibility, Dr. Vera Cheva, I think is how she says it. I'm really sorry. It's a Russian name. She's a president of an NGO based in Moscow. In June of 2020, she did a wonderful article of why human trafficking, or I'm paraphrasing, you can find it, but it's why corporate social responsibility matters when it comes to fighting human trafficking. Really well written article. The other thing, we've been talking about, and maybe a little bit skirting around willful blindness. And when we've talked about the partners, the technology, the information, and now the risk of financial institutions getting in that willful blindness compartment or area, whatever, is human trafficking is definitely money laundering. There's no question. And to the extent that you're assessed as under the BSA, the most burdensome, exacting, oppressive civil money penalties are applied for willful violations. So it's just really important to keep that in mind, in my opinion. I apologize for the stuttering. I'm thinking out loud.
I would like to, with this new focus on the risk-based approach, with our national priorities that we have to bake into our programs, I would like to see the exam manual changed, because the exam manual actually says banks are not obligated to investigate or confirm the underlying crime. As a result, in 2021, we had 4,000 instances of using human trafficking in a SAR, of 3 million SARs filed. So I would like to see the exam manual change somehow to at least encourage banks that if they suspect human trafficking, to maybe go that extra step. And the regulators have to give a little forbearance to allow them to do it. Maybe they give up something else and focus a little bit more on something that is arguably the ultimate risk that we're facing today.
That's a very good suggestion. Carol, any last thoughts from you?
I think I would just state the obvious and commend ATII for being one of the organizations out there trying to get the message out, and for giving us this opportunity to share some thoughts.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well said.
Thank you. Thank you all for this wonderful panel. As I said, it's always my favorite. I really enjoy it, and echo Carol. Thank you, ATII, for giving the opportunity to help in maybe just a little way to help people help others. So thank you all.
Thank you.